Hello, this is Chuck Stull with an introduction to the beer industry. Now, this is an industry that's interesting for several reasons that we'll look at over the next few videos. One is the market structure and its change over time. A second is the tension between production efficiencies and transportation cost. And the third is the nature of product differentiation. But in this video, we'll start with the history and production process and a little bit of the economics. Beer is perhaps our oldest manufacturing industry. Archaeologists have successfully brewed beer using a recipe from ancient Egypt. The brewing industry was well developed in medieval Europe, and some monasteries are still famous from that era for their beer brewing. The regulation of beer is one of the oldest quality restrictions or the oldest quality regulations. The Bavarian Purity Law, passed in 1516, required beer to have only three ingredients: barley, hops, and water. This was before they even knew yeast was the active ingredient fermenting the sugars to make the alcohol. The Bavarian Purity Law was enforced in Germany until the 1990s, when they needed to accept other kinds of grains in compliance with European Union rules. But it still is used to signal quality, and you can find certain beers that still reference that centuries-old quality regulation. Now, if we look at the vertical chain of production, beer starts with agricultural products, barley or other grains, if we're not following that purity law, and hops. The second stage is malting. This is where grains are germinated, started to sprout, and then roasted. The third stage, which is where the beer itself gets made, is the brewing stage. This ferments the sugars in the malt into alcohol. The beer is then packaged into bottles, cans, or kegs, and then distributed through wholesalers to retail outlets, and broadly divided into on-premise, bars and restaurants, and off-premise, beer to be consumed at home sold through stores. Now, in the U.S., there are many laws that prevent vertical integration, and some of that has to do with laws restricting the ownership of retail outlets. And in most states, wholesalers and distributors need to be independent, cannot be owned by the brewers. So most of our brewers focus on the brewing and bottling and not the distribution. If we look at the production of beer, brewing also has a series of steps where the grains and hops are processed in vats, brew kettles, fermentation tanks. Now, if you look at the shapes of these objects, you should come up with an idea we talked about very early in this class in terms of economies of scale. And that is the idea of dimensional economies. With a larger vat or a larger brew kettle, volume increases faster than costs, so bigger is better. And so the brewing industry does exhibit very large economies of scale. And these are mainly from dimensional economies. The minimum efficient scale for a brewery has been estimated at about 4.5 million barrels per year, and smaller breweries are going to have much higher costs. Now, as we get bigger than that, there are additional benefits, some modest cost savings, up to about 8 million barrels a year. So you need to be around 4.5 to play the game competitively, and then some further savings up to 8 million. Now, very small breweries, those that are producing 1 to 2 million barrels a year, face a substantial cost disadvantage. And microbreweries, which we'll talk about towards the very end of our discussion in this industry, are even more costly because they don't have the advantage of any of those economies of scale. There are further economies in packaging. A modern bottling plant can package something like 1,100 bottles in a minute or 2,000 cans of beer per minute, and you need a large brewery to use bottling capacity efficiently. So these economies of scale, of course, are very important in determining the structure of the industry, which is one of the topics we'll be looking at next. This has been Chuck Stull looking at the beer industry. Cheers.